Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. If you credit Elon Musk with getting the idea of electric vehicles humming in this country, well, you're about 125 years late to the party. It was a gentleman named Albert Pope who demonstrated the first mass-produced electric vehicle in the U.S. way back in 1897 in Hartford. And it was an invention also in the 1800s, produced in the Naugatuck River Valley, that made it all possible. Our guest today is Joe Iamartino. Now, when he's not managing the Thompson, Connecticut Historical Society, his day job is Chief Technology Officer for the Marmon Electrical Group. Well, that firm owns the Naugatuck Valley Rubber Company that made EVs possible. It's a fascinating history, and Joe's going to be along in just a minute to tell us more. This week's trivia question: in what Connecticut town was the saying, "The Russians are coming," heard quite loudly in the 1920s? We'll stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Today's episode is really a story about the convergence of two different industries in Connecticut, two industries that, like many others, put Connecticut at the top of the national stage in both categories. Now, this episode may come as a surprise to some, but it's automobile manufacturing. That's the first one. After all, we think of the Midwest, and Detroit is the car capital of the country, home to places like Ford and GM. Or, even more pertinent to this story, we may think of Fremont, California. That's where the largest Tesla EV manufacturing facility in the country is located. But step aside Elon Musk and Jim Farley, CEO of Ford. It's Albert Pope whose name you should be praising, the original Elon Musk of sorts. More on him in just a moment. Well, meantime, about a half a century earlier, in the year 1800, a man whose name you're likely much more familiar with was born in New Haven. His name, Charles Goodyear, and he was a direct descendant of one of the founders of the original New Haven colony back in the 1600s. You hear about Goodyear to this very day thanks to a company being created in 1897 that not only honored him by using his name for their firm, the Goodyear Tire Company, but they plastered his name on the side of that infamous Goodyear blimp that everybody's seen at least on a television picture, if not live and in person. Well, Goodyear invented vulcanized rubber. Now, that's the ability to keep pure rubber, which is a sappy substance that comes from the center of particular trees in Brazil, from freezing and cracking when it gets frozen cold, and from melting and stinking during warm weather. Well, he made rubber what it is today. Now, you may have already jumped to conclusions about how automotive and rubber came together, and you're probably thinking it was the tires on the car, right? Well, for this particular story, that's not what we're aiming for. When Albert Pope left his family's lumber business in Massachusetts, he found himself going to Philadelphia in the year 1876. Now, that was the 100th anniversary of the founding of our nation, and in Philly, they were having a technology expo to celebrate. Well, Pope came face to face for the first time with an invention out of Europe called the bicycle. Well, what do bikes have to do with the automotive business? Hang tight. Trust me, it's a good story. Pope went to Europe. He learned how they made bicycles. He bought the rights to make them in the U.S. and then set up shop as the Pope Manufacturing Company right in downtown Hartford, where Pope Park is today, if you want to go on Google Maps and find it. He would also become the leading bike manufacturer in the entire United States and the largest manufacturer in New England. Now, remember, at this point in time, the main means of transportation was still the horse and buggy. Now, Pope was a forward-thinking guy, and he noticed two important things. First of all, after years of selling his bicycles, he noticed that the popularity of them started to wane a little bit. Number two, he saw that entrepreneurs and engineers were starting to focus on something called the internal combustion engine. That is, an engine powered by gasoline that would propel a carriage without a horse. Well, Pope studied these trends and he came to his own conclusion. He realized a horseless carriage was coming, but he felt it would be safer, quieter, and cleaner if that carriage was powered by electricity, not a noisy, fume-producing gasoline engine. So he set out to make electric vehicles, and he would become the leader in the entire country, just like his bicycle company had been. He was way ahead of Henry Ford and the other Midwest gasoline-powered car manufacturers at that time. Well, Pope pretty much already had what he needed in Connecticut because the state was already a leader in making carriages for horses, and he had a source for lead-acid batteries to power the new invention. What was missing was the component that he needed, and the solution was waiting about 30 miles to the south of him in Seymour, Connecticut. Now, that's where today's story picks up. It turns out that, yes, rubber made the first electric vehicles possible, but again, we're not talking about rubber tires. Here to tell us what it was is the Chief Technology Officer of the Marmon Electrical Group, a firm that owns the Carright Corporation in Seymour, where this incredible breakthrough in rubber technology occurred. Now, you may recognize the CTO's name. It's Joe Iamartino. He's been on Amazing Tales CT previously in his role as director of the Thompson, Connecticut Historical Society. On his day job, he's the technology chieftain at Marmon Electrical Group, and what an incredible story this is about the linkage between automotive and rubber. Joe, I want to start off talking about that portion of this incredible story where you are centrally involved, the rubber end of this story. Now, you're the Chief Technology Officer for the Marmon Group, and the Marmon Group bought Carright, based in Seymour, I think back in like 1999, and it was at Carright on Day Street in Seymour near Route 8 where some incredible inventions took place that your company has the legacy to this. So let's start off talking about what can you tell me about how did we get from Charles Goodyear, the guy who vulcanized rubber, down to his nephew, Austin Goodyear Day. What's that connection? How did he get to Carright? Tell us that story.
We know that Charles Goodyear bankrupted himself numerous times in his insane quest to develop vulcanized rubber. Always putting his family second to his quest. I'm not meaning to make him sound as a bad person. He's not. He was just so fascinated by this technology. Well, as it came to pass, the son of a cousin, Austin Goodyear Day, took what his father invested in with Mr. Goodyear and was able to take that technology because of the family connections and set up his rubber insulated cable factory in Seymour, Connecticut.
That's the same building that's there today, correct?
It's on that site. Yes, it is. Within a very short period of time, besides the explosion in the rubber industry, now all of a sudden, what could be done with that rubber is that Austin Goodyear Day had to develop another technology. And that technology was what's called a crosshead extruder, where you could take the rubber and put it onto wire. One of the big opportunities for it was telegraph wire. Telegraph wire was put out well before Samuel Morse came into it, but the wire was not consistent. It wasn't water protected. And all of a sudden, when the rubber came out and they applied it over wire, it became a fascinating subject around the world. In 1867, at the Paris Exposition, Day's group won 2 gold medals for Samuel Morse's underground rubber telegraph wire. And that was really the first successful commercial use of communication electrical wires insulated with rubber.
Wow. So now, as I understand it, by the way, you still have that actual machine that he invented?
Yeah. The engineer DeWolf developed it, and it still fascinates people who see it today.
So now, this is interesting because when you talk about the Naugatuck River Valley in Connecticut and the rubber industry there, some people get confused because they say, didn't it start in Naugatuck? Now, that's where Charles Goodyear built his facility, correct? The one where he started selling to companies like Uniroyal?
That's right. That's the location where he was. The Day facility is in Seymour.
And the interesting thing, too, I think, is that Charles Goodyear did this at least in part because his dad had built his factory in the early 1800s, which made pearl buttons, and he ended up selling all the buttons to the U.S. Army for the War of 1812, which is how the Goodyear family made a lot of money. Of course, they were original descendants from the original founders of New Haven as well, so a lot of stuff there. Now, this is very important what Julius Day's son, Austin Goodyear Day, has come up with. Austin Goodyear Day now has demonstrated that you can put rubber around wire, make it waterproof, and make it therefore a lot more effective and a lot safer. What did that do that made what Albert Pope was doing in Hartford with electric vehicles? How did those two come together?
Well, it begins with understanding of electrical power generation. Edison came out with DC power. DC power has a problem with distance. So you lose too much power over distance. So it could only function in the center of cities. And the farther you got out of the cities, you just didn't have electricity outside those regions. So that's why electric vehicles, when they were first developed, Pope being, the leader of that, our challenge was, how do you get those vehicles charged? Electric vehicles versus gasoline vehicles. Electric, having in 1897 a fleet of taxis in New York and Hartford, for example, they had to be recharged, and that could only be done in the city centers. What did they use? Rubber insulated cables from our Austin Goodyear Days facility.
Now, let's bring in Tesla into this as well, not the Tesla electric vehicle manufacturer right now, but the actual inventor of alternating current. Could you explain in simple words for the layman what the difference was and why that was so important between what Edison was doing with direct current?
Sure. There was a great debate in the early years of electricity that DC was better than AC. AC had the benefit of being able to be transmitted over long distances with low losses. And that's what the famous inventor Tesla came up with. Unfortunately, Tesla was up against a powerhouse and Thomas Edison, and Edison was backing direct current. Direct current is very inefficient over long distances. So short distance from the generation plant, it worked fine. When you start to extend the distances, it's very inefficient. So you had to build many, many generating plants in order to cover a city. Whereas the Tesla technology, you could build a centralized plant and cover much more territory.
Fascinating. Now, when you stop to think, here you have in Seymour, the Caride Corporation putting together these cables. And in Hartford, you have Albert Pope now starting to pump out up to 2,000 electric vehicles per year. And in order to power these, of course, now you have to have these cables. And to me, when you put this all together in sort of a timeline as to how all this was happening and in Connecticut, to me, it's just fascinating. And you're sitting in the position of a chief technology officer who comes up with these ideas and implements these ideas. When you look back on this and you see how it developed, what are some of the thoughts that come to mind for you?
Well, I think it's fascinating that we have in Connecticut history all of the right elements to become a leader in the automotive industry. I mean, there was nothing like Connecticut in the country. We had the manufacturing expertise for building bicycles, machine tools. We had everything we needed here. And to think that in the first years of electric vehicles that we dominated in this space, it makes me very proud. Now, what would it have taken to expand that across the country and make it last from then to now? It would have been chargers. You had to be able to charge your vehicles if you sold them to people. And that same technology issue we have today. The federal government right now is trying to install chargers all along the main highways and in the inner cities to make sure your next electric vehicle can be charged conveniently.
Now, is the same supply chain occurring now? I assume these same cables are coming into play with the charging apparatus that we're trying to put together today as well, correct?
Absolutely. There's a race right now going on, a huge race in industry to bring the most efficient chargers to charge those vehicles as fast as possible when you pull in. You want that same experience today when you pull in and put gas in your vehicle. You don't want to have to sit there for an hour. You want a fast charger. So a DC fast charger, the time of charging is dropping every year, and the batteries in the vehicles are getting larger, moving up to 920 volts, for example. That will allow you to charge those vehicles. So you just have time to stop, get a coffee, go to the restroom, and get right back. You're ready to jump in your car and go.
Yeah, I was just reading up on the impact this will have on what we today call gasoline stations, and how this is, you're absolutely right, as the time to charge decreases and people won't have to wait an hour or 2 hours, that will facilitate the process. But until then, they may actually start building service stations that look more like little mini retail centers so people can stop for an hour, plug in their car, and go shopping.
Yeah, that's certainly one way to look at it, Mike. There's another way to look at it. There's a difference between gas vehicles and electric vehicles too, where most electric vehicles sit at home at night. And a vast majority of electric vehicles will be charged at a slow rate, parked in your garage or parked in a some type of a charging center near your apartment building. When do you need these fast chargers? Well, you need them when you're on a long distance travel. And let's say 7 to 10% of all the chargers in North America will be those fast charger types. Most can be lower cost home chargers. And just remember, you don't have a gas pump in your garage today. So there's going to be a dynamic change in the way we refuel our vehicles, so to speak.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, Connecticut has so many inventions to its name, and the fact that we were the absolute hands-down leader in the manufacturing of EVs with the electrical wiring needed to power them, well, it's simply amazing. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Joe Iamartino, Chief Technology Officer for the Marmon Electrical Group, owners of the Caride Corporation Wire Factory in Seymour, and also director of the Thompson Historical Society after his 9-to-5 obligations are fulfilled. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, in what Connecticut town was the saying, "The Russians are coming," heard quite loudly in the 1920s? Well, the answer is Southbury. The Russian village is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's celebrating this year its 100th anniversary. Founded by the son of famed Russian author Leo Tolstoy, that's right, War and Peace, and it's a truly magical place if you've never been there. Well, next week we're going to speak with a woman who's currently in her 90s, grew up in the village back when Russian was the language spoken there. A fascinating interview. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.